Howdy, y'all. My name is Andy King, and welcome to another episode of King's Comics. Thank you so much for the support I've been seeing, and thank you guys just for all the feedback you've been providing. I've been trying to incorporate as much of that as possible, and please pardon my dust while I am setting up a new kind of studio and shop. Regardless, I keep getting asked, and even people sliding into my DMs on Instagram, what does my comic book collection consist of? Like, I've already mentioned that I have a pretty decent sized comic book collection, and the thing is that, people have larger collections than me, but I've been trying to accumulate comics just over the years. I started collecting them when I was in high school, but that was stuff like Watchmen and Civil War. But now my collection's grown to about, I think 500, somewhere in that ballpark of 500 collected editions of comics. And then I've lent out a couple, so so those are missing. And then there's several I haven't read yet. So if today there are some that you're losing track of, maybe there's 50 to 100 that are misplaced. That's because I've either lent them out to a friend or because I'm still trying to read them and keep up with them. So that being said, today this is going to be split into multiple parts because I have about 500 comics to get through once again. So I guess let's go ahead and without further ado, let's start. And if y'all could keep count for me, I'm going to try. But if y'all could keep count for me, that would be awesome. So let's start. So I got this actually, I think last year or a year ago. This is the Flash Omnibus. It's by Francis Manapul and Brian Buccellato. This is the New 52 Flash. So for those familiar with the New 52, it was one of DC Comics reboot events where they came up with these new versions of characters like Superman, Batman, like all the DC characters. But also a lot of them kind of went missing or just didn't have good reboots. And there were some strong runs like the Flash as well as Batman and Wonder Woman had like some of the strongest runs, but a lot of them just kind of fell flat, which led to the current DC rebirth, right? So that's what we're seeing now, and it's pretty awesome. I really enjoyed this run. I really enjoyed Francis Manapul's art. It's fantastic, and I just really love it. And this is the entire collected edition of this creative team's work on the Flash during the New 52 era. Then we have Snowpiercer. For those of you who maybe have seen the movie, I think it was a Korean film. I think it had a Korean director or something of the sort, but it's based on a French graphic novel called Snowpiercer, or Le Transierge, or something like that. I straight up don't remember the French name. And there's actually a couple of French comics that I read that I really enjoy. So you've got Snowpiercer, you've got Black Sad, which is about an anthropomorphic cat detective. It's really awesome. And then you've got Last Man, which I think you actually see that on my shelf right now. But we'll go get there. So Snowpiercer, the movie was based on this, and I highly recommend seeing the movie. It's got Chris Evans in it. But this comic is along the same premise of the movie. You've got these giant mobile trains that are just moving across just this frozen post-apocalyptic wasteland. And they're just all encompassing, all accommodating. You have multiple classes on these trains, so there's like a social hierarchy, and there's just this kind of question lingering in the back of how this thing runs and what happens when this thing stops. So it's a very interesting comic. I've got volumes 2 and 3 as well. I got them all at half-price books for like $5 each, so I'm just trying to read through them, but I've read volume 1. It touches a lot more on the political and social sides, narratives, than the movie, so I highly recommend it. So, next we have Thor, God of Thunder. And this one is by, Jason Aaron and, Esad Ribic. So so Esad Ribic is also the guy who illustrated Secret Wars, if anyone read that somewhat recent event by Marvel Comics. But the Thor God of Thunder, this is probably my favorite version of Thor that I've seen, or at least one of my favorite Thor runs, because it involves the God Butcher arc. And the God Butcher arc is about this anti-theist being that's going across the universe, killing any god he can find. It's incredible. You realize that Thor has actually encountered this being multiple times across his lifetime, across past, present, and future. And this being has this weapon, this sentient weapon called the Necroblade, just this black kind of mist that formed upon him, which we later come to find in the current Venom run by Donny Cates is one of the original symbiotes, like a weaponized symbiote, similar to Venom. So it's really awesome, everything that gets in the lore, because with the Necroblade, at one point Thor has to use it to stop the God Butcher's plans, as well as team up with his past, present, and future selves have to team up, leading to him wielding two Mjolnirs at once. And honestly, it's just a sight to behold. This comic's incredible. I highly recommend it for anyone who's a Thor fan, for anyone who can read it. Please give it a shot. Here we go. I'm trying to see if I can find the panel. I might not be able to, but that being said, this is just such a good comic run. And yeah, there you go. You've got a Thor wielding two Mjolnirs right there to destroy just the schemes of this God Butcher. It's amazing. So then let's get into Captain America. This is volume 1. I have another volume lying around somewhere, but this is volume 1, Castaway in Dimension Z. Captain America stumbles into this kind of secret dimension run by Baron Zemo, and it just ends up being there for years. I mean, decades on end, because it's got a different timeline, or a different, I guess, just time scale than our own dimension. So he's in there for maybe days or weeks, similar to when we see Bruce Banner in Thor Ragnarok, having been away for maybe a couple of years or weeks, but it feeling like weeks, and it feels like eons to him. So that's kind of what happens here. Captain America even takes and adopts Baron Zemo's son in this book. It's actually, wait a minute, is it Baron Zemo? No, it's not. It's not Baron Zemo. It's, gosh, this is gonna kill me, but I'm not even gonna focus on it. Either way, Zola. It's Armin Zola. So this is a fun run. I've got the first two comics. It's by one of my favorite authors, Rick Remender, who does a lot of good work as well as indie work. Wrote another one of my favorite comics, Fear Agent, and he teams up with John Romita Jr., who they make a passive reference to him in Into the Spider-Verse when you see this shop called Romita's Ramen. I'm not gonna go on too much longer about that. We have a lot more comics to get through. Then we have Hawkeye. This is probably the best Hawkeye run I've read. It's by Matt Fraction and David Aja. So you've got a lot of kind of Spanish-influenced art and just painted art, which is very beautiful. And it's a great art just because it's this kind of they call it normcore, which is kind of weird, but it's basically about Hawkeye. It capitalizes on the fact that Hawkeye is not a superpowered hero. So he's kind of defending the apartment complex he lives in from these kind of more, I don't know, like mafia-based mafiosos and like just smaller scale villains and just criminals. So it's really fun read. You do see him encounter some superpowered foes, but it's just a good book. I've got all 3 volumes. Two of those the first 2 are by Fraction, and the third one is by Jeff Lemire, another one of my favorite authors. Oh my gosh. Then we get into Watchmen. So Watchmen is, if not my favorite, one of my favorite novels, graphic novels of all time, if not just books or pieces of media of all time. It's how I got introduced into comics, and it's got a lot of prose-based narrative and work, so it's a very dense comic to read, but it's one of the greatest graphic novels and largely considered to be of all time. It's one of Time Magazine's 100 best novels of all time. Not comic, not graphic novel, but novel of all time. There's this kind of special subgenre it occupies known as deconstruction, which is the idea of taking a well-known genre or trope and just tearing it, like dissecting it, to the point that there's only one real superhero or super-powered person in it, which is Dr. Manhattan, who is playing a critical role in the current DC event Doomsday Clock. Let's keep going. This is an interesting one. It's Walking Shadows. So what a lot of people don't realize is that before graphic novels, right, the kind of original graphic novels were wood carvings and screen printings. And a lot of those, because they would just be like very simplistic drawings, were just very simple and wouldn't have words on them. So if you look through this, the narrative is conveyed by just images. I mean, because these would be etched into wooden blocks and then pressed onto a page. So this has been recaptured, and the style kind of emulated in this book. I've got a couple more like this just because it's an interesting part of the medium to me, but there's also several other styles of graphic novels that I try to collect and just look into because of how variant they can be. We got a lot to go through, so I'm going to try to speed things up. So Tetris, this one's by Box Brown. In a previous video, I think that I had mentioned the idea that there's a lot more to graphic novels than just superheroes, and this is a biographical narrative on the creation of Tetris, the video game. I mean, all the way from past to like present, dang near, like the state of Tetris and the Tetris company. But it's an incredible read, and Box Brown actually has this history of doing a lot of biographical and true life comics or graphic novels. He's done another one of my favorites about Andre the Giant, as well as one about Andy Kaufman and one about, I think that's the main three I can think of. But he's a great author, artist. He's one of those who is his own illustrator and writer as well. So he's the one researching these stories, penning them as well as inking them, like taking them to page. I've got 3 works by him, and I'll get into those later. Then we've got Superman American Alien. So this is by Max Landis, who he's actually written for, there's this interesting part of the internet, this subculture called SCP, Secure, Contain, Protect. It's one of my favorite wikis to read about just these weird creatures and objects, either just extravagant technology or could destroy mankind, etc., etc. But he does a lot of writing like that, as well as screenplay writing. But he wrote one of my favorite Superman stories. It's because this is a anthological work. So it's got, I think, 7 different takes on Superman, each with a different artist. And you get to see just different phases of Superman in his life, from him learning how to fly, from him just trying to becoming a street level vigilante, his first encounter with Lex Luthor and Batman, as well as when he finally has to fight his first extraterrestrial threat who can hold a candle to him with regards to strength. So, once again, highly encourage it. And that's another thing. I try to only collect, for the most part, comics that have some level of sentimentality to me. So that's why I read a lot from the library or online, is because I want to check things out. I can't buy everything because it can be either expensive or just because it doesn't have a lot of sentimentality, or I'm checking a box in terms of reading it and exploring more of the medium. And then we get into Southern Bastards. Man, this is Southern Bastards is pretty freaking amazing. So, especially growing up in the South, like I said, you'll see that one of my hashtags is ATX. I'm from this small town, Hutto, Texas, and I was born in Georgia. But I've lived in Texas the majority of my life. So this one hits close to home because it's just about these extremes of football in the context of of the South in Alabama. And it just gets taken to the extreme where you have these guys running the town based on just wanting a good football team. They own it. People associate so much with football, being the best in the high school level of football. It's incredible just because of how dark, twisted, and brutal the narrative is. Also, while funny when you put it in that backdrop of how ludicrous it is. Then the creative team on this is, I believe, Jason Aaron and Jason Latour. So I believe it was Jason Latour. Let's see, I think it was Jason Latour who came up with Spider-Gwen, who was the creator of Spider-Gwen. So, gosh, yes, it was Jason Latour who created Spider-Gwen. I follow him on Instagram as well, and he's just stoked about the fact that he gets to see this creation from page to screen. So he's the guy who illustrates Southern Bastards, which this is an image comic, and highly recommend that series. Then we get into the Sheriff of Babylon. So if anyone's kind of seen Sicario or something like that, this is almost like a Middle Eastern Sicario. It takes place in Baghdad with this cop who's this, I guess, military officer who's retired and gone into contract work. So he's trying to train the military police that are in Baghdad. So this one is also kind of complex because it's talking about this social and political based narrative after a murder goes on, as well as just kind of the fear and xenophobia associated with our different classes and social structures, and just cultures. This is by Tom King, who was kind of an up-and-coming I guess, author for a while, but then kind of came into like the forefront and prominence when he started writing. The recent Batman run. So he's on Batman right now after Scott Snyder, and his run is great, but it's also a little controversial because people are just very up in the air about it. But I think he has some of the strongest portrayals from an emotional stance of Batman in that run, as well as of his villains, especially because we see like a huge kind of villain in the arc be Bane. And now we get into Seconds by Brian Lee O'Malley. So for those of you who may or may not know Brian Lee O'Malley or think that the art style looks a little bit similar, you may know him from Scott Pilgrim. He's the original creator of Scott Pilgrim, and Brian Lee O'Malley is also a pretty frequent, writer-illustrator. So he writes and illustrates his own comics. He's got a love of Canadian culture, as well as he's from Canada, as well as just video game history, social, pop culture. So that's why Scott Pilgrim has that interwoven and interlaced into it. Seconds is great. It's not as obviously laden with that kind of a narrative and construct, but it is a very deep narrative on just kind of second chances, hence the name Seconds, as well as what do we do when we've messed up and we are afforded kind of grace with respect to just having a second chance or the ability to go back. All right, next we move on to Roasted. I haven't read this one. I actually got it as a complete joke because it was like, not to say to the author artist team that it's a joke. It's just more so I bought this as a joke because there were 2 copies in a half price books I was at, and which is like, a thrift bookstore. But then I noticed that the author and artist name was Andy Riley, and this is stupid because my first name is Andy and one of my best friends' first names is Riley, so I got us each a copy just so that we could kind of have that running joke. Then we get into the Pushman and Other Stories. This is another kind of anthological work, which is a collection of stories, like, just other stories that are kind of typically not related or only related like in passing, like being in the same universe. But Yoshiro Tatsumi is similar to Osamu Tezuka. He's one of the kind of fathers, if you will, of manga. One of those at the start of the medium who led to what Japanese and Eastern comics are today. So that's why I have this work. I also have one that I'm trying to work through. I don't think I can see it over there, called A Drifting Life, which is a biographical narrative on him and how he came to prominence in manga. But I believe it's autobiographical, so he's writing and illustrating his kind of just history. So it's a memoir in the graphical format. Then we get into Mythos, Marvel Mythos. This is a great take on just these original, slightly modernized origin stories for a lot of heroes. We get to see the Fantastic Four, we get to see Ghost Rider, Silver Surfer, actually not Silver Surfer, the X-Men, Spider-Man, and I think that's about it that I'm thinking of. Yep, you get Ghost Rider, X-Men, Captain America, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Hulk. It's beautiful. The artwork is all painted by Paulo Rivera, who I just love and follow on Instagram as well. But it's incredible because he does his own just kind of modeling and just gesture poses for whenever he's like drawing or painting for reference. And he actually did the first several arcs of Mark Waid's run of Daredevil, which was several years back. He's an incredibly talented artist, as is Paul Jenkins, who has worked on Marvel for years, as well as some of the older, like just more beloved Marvel works. Then we get into Killing and Dying. A common theme you'll notice is that I love anthological works or compendiums, like just a series of unrelated works. I was referring to I guess deconstruction earlier. So then there's also, we're going to tie that into another genre, which especially for fans of anime and manga, they'll know this, or manga, you'll know this, which is called Slice of Life. It's literally just kind of a very downplayed idea of like this story or this series is just about the ongoings of the protagonists and the deuteragonists, the main characters, and whoever they interact with. So then Killing and Dying is one of those novels that is a deconstruction of that, which Adrian Tomine uses that as a consistent theme. He's another author. He's another writer artist who likes to do his own works, and I believe he also draws for the New York Times, or that might be someone else that I'm thinking of. But he also does other formats of illustration as well as works. But he likes to deconstruct the slice of life narrative, and that's especially prominent in Killing and Dying, where he takes several just interesting individuals with different walks of life and circumstances, and just goes on about like the kind of nuances in their day-to-day life and just the fractures in, well, what we look like as humans. Then we go into Iscariot. Iscariot is this interesting novel. I don't even know how I picked it up. I think I had a recommendation from someone on it, but it's another indie work by a label called Archaea. The big three in, I talk about this in another video, but the big three in graphic novels are going to be Marvel, DC, and Image. The first two focus a lot more on superhero works, and the last, Image, focuses a lot more on indie works. And that one was actually formed by Todd McFarlane, famous for being like one of the big pen and co-creators for Venom, as well as for writing a lot of Spider-Man arcs. He's like the founder and created Spawn, as well as Robert Kirkman, author of The Walking Dead and Invincible. So Iscariot is just this narrative, not really narrative, but this story of a young girl finding just this whole magical underworld and being able to get powers, and how she uses that and interacts with the world, just finally having power and being able to do something about things that she sees goes wrong. It's a great graphic novel for young adults as well as kids. It kind of has some, I guess, hard truths about reality, as well as what we do and what kind of interaction we have with adults or kids, or even are able to do or shouldn't do, even if we are granted great power. Because with great power comes great responsibility. Then we get into Fragments of Horror. This is another collection of comics by one of my favorite mangaka, or manga artists or writers. So Junji Ito also likes to do a lot of his own writing and drawing. So in Fragments of Horror, we see and he's more famous for what Fragments of Horror is about, which is just a collection of horror stories. It's very messed up. I think one of the stories that's included in this is one that some people are familiar about in passing, which is the faulted Amigahara, I think it's called. But it's about these people finding this cliff with these human-shaped holes in them, and as soon as they see them, they just say, "Oh, that hole's for me. That hole's for me," and they just climb into it, and like they start descending into these human-shaped pits that match them exactly. Either way, it's a collection of very scary stories. The artwork is just kind of twisted, and it's kind of messed up that I love it, but I do. Then we get into Essex County. So I talked about Jeff Lemire earlier, and he's another, like, one of my favorite authors, as well as one of my favorite artists. He does a lot of his own art as well as writing, and it's typically very rare that he'll draw for someone else, but he's actually drawn for Scott Snyder, who did the Batman run prior to Tom King. But in Essex County, Jeff Lemire is from Canada, and like kind of pays homage to it with a lot of slice of life stories that interconnect about Canada. There's three main arcs. It's just kind of about their ongoings and just these really hard-hitting pastoral as well as family-based works, and just some harsh realities about what it means to be family, and the kind of sacrifices, as well as just what letting go means and forgiveness means. Oh, I forgot about this one. And okay, so this one's called The End by Anders Nilsen. He's kind of a more abstract author and author artist once again, and it's in his publisher Fantagraphics, and this one's about him kind of coming to terms with the loss of his lover or wife, I forget which, but it's very raw emotionally. You can tell that a lot of his works, rather than being composed, are just sheer emotion displayed on the page without much consideration for, having a semblance of a structure or anything that is just kind of conventional with respect to modern graphic novels. So it's a very raw work. I would highly recommend kind of studying yourself before reading it. because it kind of took me by surprise, especially because I picked it up at an interesting point in my life. But so yeah, that's all we have for today, y'all. I'm just gonna kind of end it right there because I could go on and on about my collection, and as you can tell, I have a lot more to discuss. So we'll be going over this in a part 2 coming up soon. But if you liked today's video, please, I encourage you to drop a comment down below just as a, I don't know, feedback or suggestion if you have anything that I missed or would like to hear more about, as well as to please hit that like button. If you really like today's video, hit the subscribe or even share it with friends and family. Because it's Christmas season and I'm all about giving, I am going to try to do a couple of giveaways. Once again, maybe some of y'all have seen this, but I'll kind of have them posted in the discussion channel or something like that, just very infrequently. But with respect to that, y'all, thanks so much for joining today, and this has been another episode of King's Comics.